Good evening, church. We're getting together here Wednesday night. It is March 31st, and so we're just going to look through some studies that we've been doing, or I've been doing, and I shared part of that with you last week. If you see me with my jacket on, it's a little cold outside, and this being an older house, the insulation isn't all that great, and so it gets awfully cold in here sometimes, and so that's why I have my jacket on. So anyhow, this week, or actually last week, we started a series discussing or looking over the Greco-Roman world and how either had influence or had impact on the first century Christian and how they lived and how they related to and how they were impacted by the things that were going on in Rome and in the Roman and Greco world in which they lived in. So last week we talked quite a bit about the father-daughter-son relationship. We talked a lot about how the father had absolute power over their family in the non-Jewish family, and how the father also was responsible for a lot of what is called the infanticide, which is basically the killing of infants that weren't going to contribute to the overall well-being of the family. And so we discussed that for a little while. And so what we're going to do this week is we're going to talk about infanticide among the Jews. Okay? So some common, about infanticide among the Jews. Last week it was among the non-Jews. This week it's going to be about, or how it went about in the non-Jewish world. So while infanticide was pretty common among the non-Jews, infanticide or this idea of exposure that we talked about last week of infants was commonly or uniformly condemned. All right, I want to make sure I say that. It was uniformly condemned in Jewish literature. Philo, who is a Jewish philosopher, he equated infanticide with exposure. So exposure and infanticide was pretty much the same to either one of it was basically the same. And the reason for that was because regardless of which one you did, the result was usually the same, which was a dead child or a dead infant. And so Philo announces that Jews do no such thing because Moses, he said, forbade it. Just like last week, when I upload this to YouTube, in the comment section, you're going to see all of the references that you can take a look at in your own study if you wish to learn more about this topic. And so anyhow, these are some of the same things that I studied and looked through over the years, just to try to get a better understanding of what Christians were going through. Anyhow, back to Philo. So what he does is he discusses the punishments of a man who strikes a pregnant woman in one of his writings, and it'll be in my references. He talks about what the punishment for a man would be if he strikes a woman, a pregnant woman, and then that pregnant woman ends up miscarrying the fetus. Who ends up miscarrying the fetus. And so what Philo said was anyone that would do this, that the man was guilty of murder. And so by implication, any Jew who discards a fully formed fetus will be guilty of murder. Josephus, another writer, also follows Philo's logic when he says that any mother who exposes her infant is a murderer and associates this behavior with abortion. Roman writers note that Jews raised all of their children that were born to them, while non-Jews, like we mentioned last week, they practiced the idea of infanticide or exposure of children. And that was, remember last week we talked about how if a child was born deformed, sometimes even just because she was a girl, or the father didn't think the child could contribute to the well-being, in the advancement of the family good, that they would either practice infanticide or they would practice exposure. And both of them basically resulted resulted in the death of a child. In exposure, there was an opportunity there for saving the child, but nevertheless, they pretty much both meant the same, and that was a dead child. So it's important to note that between non-Jews and Jews, that there was no evidence that Jews actually participated in what is called infanticide. So good. That's the Jews were different in how they viewed family and how they viewed children and all that. So totally different from the non-Jewish people. So there, in the Greco-Roman world, there were inheritance rights that daughters had, and there was different variations from it. So once the father agreed to raise his daughter under the Roman law, the Roman law allowed her to benefit equally from her father's estate if he died intestate. Okay? Now, if the daughter was married under what's called, I think it's called Sinai Manu, and literally what it means is without hands, which is in that system where her father retained legal authority, that's what the Manu stood for, over her, and this was the most common form of marriage. Then if this was the case, and she inherited an equal share of the family estate with her brothers, okay? So if the father retained some legal authority or retained legal authority over the daughter once she was married, then she could inherit some of the father's estate along with her brothers. Now, if she or her brothers were under the age of 12, let me back up. If she was under the age of 12 years old for girls, and then it was 14 years old for boys. So if a girl was under 12 and a boy was under 14, they would become if the father died, they would become under the care of a guardian to the father, a guardian of the father. And so the daughter or the son would have a guardian. And like I said, it was if the girl was under 12 or if the boy was under 14. And usually it was an uncle. So when her brothers came of age, they were released from the authority of the guardian, but a girl continued under the supervision of a tutor beyond what was called the age of accountability. I don't even know if that's really a word. That's something that just came into my head right now. So let me reel that back. Anyway, so when her brothers when the brother became of age, they were released from the authority of the guardian, but the girl continued to be under the authority of the guardian or a tutor. All right. So her tutor was often a relative, like I said earlier, usually a relative on her father's side, and usually it would be an uncle and then he would be responsible for supervising the sale of certain types of property, or in some cases slaves, and he would approve her will. So even when her father died, I was worried that I forgot to turn on my microphone. So even when her father died, she still didn't have the freedoms. All right. So what about marriage? So marriage under Roman rule, only certain marriages were recognized or had legal standing in the Greco-Roman world. So only when both partners were Roman citizens could a legal marriage, or the word would be matrimonium, would normally be formed. All right. So by the late Republic, the most common form of legal marriage was one in which the wife did not come under her husband's complete authority. All right, catch that? The most common form of legal authority, excuse me, my phone started talking to me. I'm not trying to talk to you, phone. Sorry about that. Get out of there. I don't know. I don't know why my Google thought I was talking to her. So anyhow, back to where was I at? All right. So So the most common form of marriage, as I mentioned a second ago, was one in which the wife did not come under her husband's complete authority. Instead, what would happen is her father remained her legal guardian. So as a result of that, she did not belong to her to her husband's family, and would usually get back her dowry if the marriage ended, which was very important for her. So this form of marriage, it was called without manus, gave Roman women more independence that they had ever known before, and considerably more, though, than the Greek women for most of the Greek history. So slowly but surely, Roman women were starting to have a little bit more independence than the Greek women throughout in the early part of that history. So here's probably something that we can't fathom as Westerners and 21st century people. It's pretty. For us, it's pretty disgusting. But the women during that time, women were treated as property. Did you get that? Women, and also for all intent and purpose, children, women were treated as property. Their fathers alone would choose who they married, and the husband would accept her based upon her dowry, her fertility, skills, and basically the skills were keeping house or weaving, because a lot of the stuff that they would weave was able to be sold. In Euripides' Medea, the title character describes that women are the most miserable creatures. That was a pretty prominent or dominant idea during this first century, a couple of hundred years prior and after. And so first, we have to buy a husband, and the reason why Euripides said that women are the most miserable creatures is because first, he says we have to buy a husband at a steep price, then take a master for our bodies. Women were married off around the age of puberty, often between ages of 14 to 16 years old, and often, to men who were around the age of 30 years old. All right, the age of 30 years old. 30 years old. That's a big gap in marriage, and so usually upon marriage, women were expected to bear children pretty soon after being married, and so this would have great effect on how mothers raised their children, because since girls were had only reached sexual maturity at a young age, and they were being married off, and soon after being married off, they were having children. They faced some extraordinary tasks in caring for and also raising children. And oftentimes, the only experience that a young mother would have would be in caring for a child through helping their own mothers raise their own siblings. But you're talking about 14 to 16 years old. She didn't have a lot of experience, and so this also carried over into how kids were taken care of during that time period. So Roman law made the minimum marriage age 12 years old for girls and 14 years old for boys. That's pretty, at least for us, horrendous kind of approach to life, and it is for us. But you got to remember that the way they lived and the length of life that they had and all that sped up a lot of this age difference. But and so they lived an entirely different experience and world that we think of today and live in today. And so anyway, so the minimum age for girls was normally 12, actually 12 to about 18 years old. All right. Men married for the first time as late as 30 years old. But in Roman culture, a 5-year difference between man and woman seems to be, in historical writings, seems to have been the most common gap in marriage. This is also true whether it be a free person or whether it was a slave. So the age of the age of first marriage for Jewish girls probably also was between the ages of 12 and 18 years old. All right. So we get to Hellenistic wives, Greek wives. They were also obligated to obey their husbands at all cost. The husband's power over his wife among the Hellenists was not so great as among the Romans, but it was still considerable. All right, so there was a little bit less power among the Hellenists, but still, it was considerable power that the husband had over the wife and or the family. So husbands, as noted, as I mentioned a second ago, they were the head of the Roman familia. All right, and they held almost absolute power over all of the members in the household. So this power, which included even the power of life and death, was called the patria potestas. Patria potestas. It had diminished considerably by the 1st century AD, but the Roman husband and father still held total control over the family and over the family's property. All right. So Philo, who was a Jewish, I mentioned a second ago, he was a Jewish intellectual, philosopher, and he was from the upper middle class, or no, actually he was from the upper class. And in Alexandria, he wrote during the early first part of the 1st century about proper Jewish family. And he said, Philo said that the family was based on three important features. It was the unbreakable bond of love and kinship, the inherently superiority of parents, and a hierarchy of male and female that associates women with the senses and men with the mind. So as I describe these things to you, when you read the New Testament seems and it appears and is a lot more progressive in that era than the Greco-Roman world found itself in. So we talk about the father having absolute power over the wife, absolute power over the children, absolute power over property, how women were considered the most miserable creatures, how infanticide was practiced among the Greco-Roman world, and how kids were put out or outcast for being either deformed or girls or weren't able to be contributors to the family. So when you think about all of those things that went on in the Greco-Roman world, and Christianity found itself living in that, and then you start listening to Paul's writings and Paul's commandments or Paul's writings, you see two different worlds. You see a world that's harsh, then you see a world that is starting to turn from the harshness of the Greco-Roman world and towards love and compassion. And so it's no wonder during the 1st century that the Greco-Roman world really turned its back or started turning on the Christian community, because they were practicing and calling for things that were out of the ordinary, things that were not normal to them, and it was actually challenging the cultural mindset of what husbands were, what men were, and what women were during that time, and is actually changing the culture and changing the culture of how men, husbands, ought to act and how women ought to be treated. Two totally different worlds. And so there was a conflict. There were stressors. And there was, for all intents and purposes, an animosity from the Greco-Roman world that fell upon the Christian world because of this totally new mindset and new teachings of Jesus that were starting to infiltrate much of society. We talk about not living in culture or not letting the world sneak into what we call the church. Then in their time, there was no such thing as separation of church and state. No such idea. State was consumed with church. Church was consumed with state. They were one and the same during the first century. All right? And so here you find Christianity living in this culture and trying to figure out how to live apart or live differently than the culture, not necessarily apart from culture, but living in culture to try to perhaps change culture. So it's interesting how I'm going to show you just a one-page PowerPoint to try to illustrate what I've been trying to talk about. And let me see if I can get it over there for you. Let me try to get it bigger. Nope, bigger. Nope, let me get it bigger. There, no, we go. There we go. All right. So remember some of the things I talked about. The power of the Father is nowhere as apparent as in his role in accepting and rejecting a child at birth. Women carry the burden of potentially bringing shame to the family by her unchaste behavior. Women were treated as property. The fathers alone would choose who they married. The husband would accept her based on her dowry, fertility, skills such as weaving. The Hellenistic wives also were obliged to obey their husbands, although they had a little bit more freedoms, but nevertheless, they still had to. Women were considered, like I said a second ago, the saddest of all creatures. Women were thought of creatures of the senses, while men were of the mind, and children were abandoned or killed because they were treated basically as property as well. So that's a very, very harsh look at the Greco-Roman world. But look at the Christianity. The New Testament ushers a new era when it came to male and female relationships. And whether we like the word or not, it became a very progressive movement. It became what they were introducing into this world was a very progressive means of living life and having freedoms that were under Jesus, which they didn't have necessarily under the Greco-Roman world. So you could say progressive, it was a progressive move in their era. And at the very least, it was an antithesis to what they were experiencing in that first century. So listen, so we just read a little bit about the Greco-Roman world and how they viewed wives, children, and family. Then you look at Paul and his writings, and Mark and such others. And Paul says, for husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church, and he gave his life for her. That is opposite of what men were expected to believe or practice in the Greco-Roman world. Mark 10:9, therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. Again, that went against everything that they believed in the first century or the Greco-Roman world. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 4 through 5, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it's not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Totally opposite of the Greco-Roman world. Romans 12:10, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves. No such thing in the Greco-Roman world, in the Greco non-Christian, non-Jew world, at least. And Ephesians 5:21, you tell a Greco-Roman man who has had the power of manhood and male dominance for all of these years, you tell him, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to your wife. Those are fighting words in the first century. Those are fighting words in the first century. So when you look at the Greco-Roman world, let me try to get back to my screen so you can see my face. There we go. So when you look at the Greco-Roman world and Christianity as it rises up during that era in the first century, you see there is a conflict, or at least you start seeing a movement that starts challenging the worldview of its time. So next week we'll take a look at a few more things in terms of the Greco-Roman world, and then we'll compare that to Scripture, and so you can see the differences between what the Greco-Roman world was like and how the Christian movement was challenging and pushing back against the view of the Greco-Roman world. And so we'll see the conflict that existed there and the challenges that Christianity was placing upon the first century Greco-Roman world. All right, good being with you. I hope to see you next week, and God bless.